Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rejoining me on the podcast is Daryl Ritchison from NDSU. He's one of my favorite weather experts out there. I appreciate him because he has really, really deep knowledge of weather. He's not afraid to be contrarian, not afraid to talk about what the data tells him. I think climate and weather and all these things has become extremely political, and I can say that also from a qualitative basis, because when I put out episodes about that topic, people are much more, what's the right word, sort of engaged or have strong opinions about it. And I'm not a weather scientist. I have my own personal opinions and political stances and things like that. But I appreciate listening to someone like Daryl because he's giving me a different point of view reading some of the same data. So as I say at the end of this podcast, if some of the things that Daryl says makes you stiffen in disagreement, that's actually probably a sign that maybe you should go do some more research into these things and understand why he can read the data that way. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to agree with him, but opening the space for different ideas that are reading data in legitimate ways and trying to get to that ground truth, that's in some ways what this podcast is all about. And I have a lot of homework to do after talking to Daryl, because he talked about things that I don't know well enough that I want to learn about, and I would commend the same approach to you in listening to this particular episode and in all episodes of this podcast. I am always trying to push buttons and get contrarian ideas out there. I would love if everything we said on this podcast was 100% accurate and correct, but it's actually more important to me to be interesting and to shake the cobwebs out of your mind and to give voice to people who have ideas that are well-grounded in analysis and science and things like that, but that may be different from the mainstream, even if in some cases they're wrong. To get a real perspective of truth, you really have to have a spectrum. It's not any one answer. So, off my soapbox, write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to hear about our wealth management services, our family office services, our research and consulting services, or if you would like to book me for a speaking event. If you want to book Daryl for a speaking event too, you can also reach out. I'll make sure that you get in touch with him. He's a great presenter. So with that, take good care of each other. Stay warm or cold or dry or whatever is best for you in whatever part of the world you're in. Cheers. See you out there. All right, Fargo's newest celebrity, fresh off his Nerd Night presentation. Daryl, it's good to see you again.
Oh, it's awesome to be on.
Daryl was saying he just gave this presentation in Fargo and that he'd never gotten so many compliments before, and he was joking with me before we hit the record button that it was because the audience had been drinking. So, listeners, I often joke that when Rob gets on for the weekly podcast, you should take a shot every time he mentions Oliver Cromwell, because Daryl, for your benefit, my business partner Rob likes to talk about Oliver Cromwell a lot for reasons that I can't figure out. But if you really want to get toasted during this podcast, take a shot every time Daryl says El Nino, and you'll probably be 2 sheets to the wind by the end.
Well, I was going to say, you're not going to make it probably 15 minutes into this podcast today.
Yeah, but they'll probably think you're the most brilliant person in the history of the universe. So there you go. Before we get to El Ninos and La Ninas and all that good stuff, why don't we start a little introspective, Daryl? I'm going to ask you what your biggest successes were last year and your biggest mistakes were last year. Your dealer's choice on whether you want to do mistakes first or successes first for last year's forecast.
Last year was very interesting. It sounds arrogant, and I really don't mean to when I say it, but I was on a hot streak, and we've really been doing well. And really in the core of the traditional corn and soybean belts in the United States last year, which was mostly dry, my analogs that I was using suggested that actually would be a better year for rain. And it was. Montana into Wyoming, parts of southwestern North Dakota, South Dakota, there was this area where they got just really, really good rains. All my analogs had that about 150 miles to the northeast and east of there. And as I'm fond of saying in my 30-plus career in meteorology, close does not count in weather. And so I was just in some ways, so proud of and happy with my forecast that my analog package worked. It had this little blob of moisture. It just did not really have it in the right place. And then temperature-wise, I still hit that pretty well, and some other things going forward. So that one was just frustrating to me. And I'm really honest. Like yesterday, I gave a couple of talks, and I always show this is when I was here a year ago. This is my forecast, and this is what happened. I'm always open about that and shared it. And then, I joked that in the areas that I was right, there's billboards of me and people are praising and all the drinks in the world are free for me. And then on the other side of the fence, because there was a very strong fence last year where it just turned dry. And I go, all those people, there's billboards, wanted dead or alive from the olden days joke about that in that area. So that was probably my biggest last year that I had. But again, I was so close to just having this great forecast. But again, I will emphasize, and I understand, folks, close does not count in weather.
Yeah. Sort of globally last year, was there anything that surprised you last year? Because one of the reasons I love talking to you is because you have a great historical perspective on what's going on with weather, and you are immune to, for instance, I'm feeling whiplash. Last week I was underneath the house insulating the pipes here because it was in the 20s in New Orleans, and the houses aren't built for that. So I'm like, furiously trying to make sure the pipes don't freeze. Today we have thunderstorms and 70 degrees and everything else. So it feels like whiplash to me. But was there anything surprising to you in 2023 globally where you stopped and were like, I've never seen that before? Or was it just sort of a typical year for you, nothing out of the ordinary?
I would say really not out of the ordinary. Probably one of the things that surprised me the most was the lack of typhoons in the Pacific Ocean last year. With the El Nino developing last year, the warmings, of course, the warming of the equatorial waters, typhoon seasons had been pretty lacking because of La Nina, as you would anticipate. Then in turn last year, I really thought we would see a little bit of an uptick, and we really never did. That would probably be one of my bigger surprises. Anyone that heard me talk, I'm sure in this podcast I've said it before, I always like reminding people X doesn't equal Y in weather. You get, El Nino's here, so this is going to happen. That type of talk. No, El Nino is the biggest factor perhaps right now, but it's not the only factor. There's other factors going on in the world. And so in turn, though, going back, for an El Nino, you would have thought you had seen a little bit of an uptick. So, that's kind of an oddball, but I think that's the one thing. But, it impacts Asia, quite a bit. The moisture, all of that stuff. In some ways, it even impacts North America. It's a long story, but those typhoons will swing around, go up into the Arctic, release that air, will come down through North America sometimes. So we didn't really see that. And I think to some degree that led to a really nice autumn weather. Most of, say, the Midwest core of the United States, a lot of the crop growing areas had a later than average frost. And I think part of that you could contribute to the fact that the typhoon season was oddly weak last year in the Western Pacific.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of why, or it's just one of those things that happen? I
think it, to some degree, dealt with this thing called multivariant El Nino index, the MEI. And the MEI, a lot of times when you're talking about El Ninos and La Ninas, everyone focuses, and I understand why, I do too, focuses on the actual sea surface temperature anomalies, how much warmer it is, how much colder it is. The MEI deals more with, well, how's it impacting pressure? How's it impacting winds? And the MEI index was just oddball for this whole cycle that we're in. It trended very weak, much weaker than every other of the last stronger El Ninos through time. So I think that might have been one of the factors. But truth be, in my world, sometimes the weather is just the weather, and it's hard to explain sometimes. Mother Nature just always keeps you puzzled, and that's why I love being a meteorologist.
All right, so that's 2023 in retrospect. Before we go to sort of what to expect next year, maybe just like what's going on in the world today, because I know we're in El Nino territory right now. I was reading something from what was it from NOAA that this could be one of the strongest El Ninos in recorded history. So kind of where are we? And I guess also help those listeners explain to them what El Nino is and sort of where we are in El Nino's development right now.
Well, the El Nino is usually referenced more professionally, for lack of a better term, as the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So even when you're in a La Nina, the exact opposite, it's still El Nino Southern Oscillation. And this is a pattern that the Pacific Ocean goes through these shifts, and really it's more of a wind shift and how the trade winds interact, and which in turn is there's that cold water current coming up the west coast of South America, and then it goes up and then it spreads along the equator and goes off to the west. But if the wind shifts, that no longer happens, so the warmer waters in the western Pacific will go eastward because really that trade winds have kind of switched or weakened, and it will warm up all the way into the equatorial areas of South America. And so this El Nino, I don't think it's going to be the strongest. It'll probably be in the top 5, but again, we only have had only so many El Ninos since we've had good records, only go back to 1950. I don't think it'll get to the 15, 16 range, which was the strongest known. This one is already starting to weaken, so temperatures are beginning to cool. So the El Nino will slowly fade and be gone by Memorial Day. It should go away pretty quickly here over the next few months. And the odds are we're going to flip-flop and go back to a La Nina by this time. I would assume next winter will be a La Nina going forward, which will impact South America for their growing season. It'll impact Australia a fair amount, I do believe, and to some degree it'll impact North America too. So really, El Nino in simple terms is the warming of the equatorial Pacific. La Nina is the cooling of the equatorial Pacific from average. So what we're going to do in 2024 is go from temperature anomalies right now are close to 2 degrees Celsius above average, and then by this upcoming summer will probably be a neutral category where we're very close to the average. And then this upcoming fall and next winter will probably end up seeing a weak La Nina, which will mean temperatures might be a 0.5 degree to 1 degree below average Celsius. So it's that 0.5 degree range over this certain area of the Pacific Ocean that equates if you're El Nino or La Nina. And really, like a lot of folks' weather, the Pacific Ocean temperatures are really never at average. They're either usually above El Nino or below La Nina. It's not too often that we're in the middle, which generally most people call La Nada, just because it's nothing. It's a very common phrase. So we'll probably be in La Nada this summer, but again, we'll transition very likely, I think, to a La Nina this upcoming fall and for the next northern hemispheric winter.
Who is so if we're still in El Nino, even if it's weakening for the next couple of months, who is that bad for? So what are the parts of the world for whom that is bad news, or are there parts of the world for whom that's bad news?
Well, this time of year, Australia, they will be planting their winter wheat here in a couple of months. Usually they start in April. And so I think Australia will end up having a pretty good winter for rain for, say, their wheat crop, but it's going to start off dry. That's probably the poster child of El Nino. Southern Oscillation is Australia. They're probably impacted the most. And the correlation is probably the strongest there. To some degree, South America, a lot of the principal soybean growing areas like Mato Grosso have been, really, really dry. La Ninas, they were very, very wet. But I think as we transition out, once their soybean crop, which is not going to be very good in many areas, once they get to their corn crop, they plant right after it, usually referenced as a safrinha corn crop, will probably do pretty good because we're transitioning away. Those are the two areas agriculturally wise. Weather-wise, North America, you're in the part of North America, the southern part of the United States, it tends to be cooler and wetter with El Ninos. Where I am in the northern tier of the United States and southern Canada tends to be warmer and drier than average. We would still love your temperatures, but we're warmer than average up here. And a little bit in Australia, not Australia, a little bit in Europe. Scandinavia with El Ninos tend to be colder than average, and they have been this winter. But there's also other influences in Europe, especially with which you and I have talked about on this podcast before, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. But those would be the factors the rest of the winter. I think, especially in North America, the pattern that's been with us this winter will probably last for a couple more months.
And Europe is still, I know it's been colder than last winter, but it's pretty easy to be colder than last winter. It was so warm. It still seems relatively warm for Europe to me.
I would not disagree. I think in our last podcast with you, I talked about that. I thought this winter will still finish above average, but not as warm as last winter. And I think I said the same thing. That's, you don't have to be a meteorologist to say that, because it's not going to be it. And of course, the cold snaps tend to make the news for obvious reasons. Heat usage goes up. And some parts of Germany had some pretty good snowstorms this winter that made international news and such. But overall, again, the balance is above average. And looking at, my analog set that I use, I still think, especially the next 2 months, because we're almost into February. So really, I think February and March, really the last 2 months of winter, to me, the odds continue to be that they're going to see above average temperatures overall. Yeah, will there be cold snaps? Of course, there will be. But probably they'll, I think, worst case scenario, be close to average. But a little bit above. I just don't see a long, prolonged period of really cold air, which they've seen a couple of them this winter. But again, like you said, they'll probably finish okay in that regards. And I mentioned it on your podcast. Once the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation switches to its cold phase, which will likely come yet this decade, based on history, or in the 2030s, that's when Europe will probably start seeing colder winters again. But until we get to that point, historically, when the AMO is positive, all the Atlantic water is warmer than average. It's just hard on really a maritime climate in much of Europe, because they're so surrounded by water. It's just tough when the water around you is warmer than average to see a long stretch of cold weather.
Somebody should have told Vladimir Putin about this multi-decadal oscillation. Maybe he would have waited to invade Ukraine so that his gas leverage over Europe would have actually mattered. But even with the Red Sea disruption, I mean, just the cumulative effect of higher temperatures than normal in Europe for so long means the reserves are good too. So they've been able to weather the storm. Oh,
Very
God,
much
that's
so.
a terrible pun to talk with you about. I hope you're not embarrassed to be
No,
on the
no,
podcast.
I say it as well.
Well, what about India? Because I was in North Dakota on the other side of the state last week talking to pulse growers, and that meant focusing a lot on India. And India had a fairly bad year, at least from a pulse crop situation. They're importing 30-40% more than they were the previous year because things were drier. The weather just wasn't right. How does all this play into the monsoon cycle? Are you expecting India to have a better year than last year? Or is it kind of up in the air? Help me think through India right now. India
is influenced quite a bit by the IOD, the Indian Ocean Dipole. So the Indian Dipole. And it's right now, it is strongly positive right now. And when that's strongly positive, just in very simple terms, is when it's positive, there's rising motion in the atmosphere over India and Pakistan and sinking motion over Australia. So Australia had, El Ninos, they're usually dry. And you have the IOD strongly positive. It's been pretty dry in much of Australia, especially Western Australia. The thing is, right now, that's very favorable for India this upcoming year. But as we gradually transition from El Nino into neutral into La Nina, that might actually switch. But I think it will occur late enough that this year, and in theory, just looking at analogs, it should really, to me, be a much, much better year for India for those reasons.
That's interesting. All right. Well, what's your forecast for 2024? What's the highlights? What do people need to know?
Where would you like to know?
Let's start with North America.
My analog package, and here's the thing. There will not be an El Nino, as I already mentioned, this summer. And I know there's some people that disagree with me. I cannot find a correlation summer weather with El Ninos in North America. Last summer, this El Nino is just not acting correctly. It's not as wet. This wetness should develop. And I hear this stuff. People send me those articles, and I always tell them there is no correlation. I don't know what these people are talking about. But when we transition out of El Nino, a strong one like this one was, the next spring is like 75-80%. If you take the 6 or 7 El Ninos, almost all of them, except there's always an exception, especially say north of Interstate 80, tends to be warm and dry. And that area in the northern tier of the United States have had a lot of bad springs in the last couple of decades. And so there's so many reasons in my world to believe that actually this year we would have a decent spring. And so that would be, north of I-80 approximately, would get out in the fields on time, and therefore would have a little bit longer growing season than the past couple, which would increase yield potential. As you probably, most people listening to this know, Iowa and Illinois, especially Iowa, they have not had a fun winter. A lot of snowstorms, quite a bit of snow. So along I-90 in that area, I think especially Iowa, Illinois, some parts of Nebraska, they might get out a little later than they usually do for planting because they will have snow to melt. But the positive is they will have a lot of moisture in the ground. And some of those areas were quite dry last summer. So that snow, as it melts, some of it will go into the rivers, of course, but because of the snowpack, their frost depth isn't very deep. So I think we'll get penetration in. So even though they might get out a little later this spring than they usually do, they'll have a really good start soil moisture-wise, which might be really important once we get into the summer. Yeah. And so in turn, going forward, I think most of the Midwest will be at or a little bit above average, so more heat units this year. A better start because of that soil moisture conditions. And although my analog package suggests there will be more dry areas and wet areas, it does not look like a widespread dry summer. I wouldn't be surprised if 2025 was, but not necessarily 2024. So there's a lot of reasons to be positive. And when we do dry down this summer, especially I think the corn can tap into that subsoil moisture that we're going to have now because of the winter. And even areas north of there got that huge, somewhat unusual storm around Christmas with all that rain. Mm-hmm. The ground wasn't frozen then, so it penetrated too. So it's such a large area, is going to have pretty good soil moisture to start. So even the areas that are dry, like 2023, there'll be news stories about it being dry, but at the same time, at the end of the year, crop ended up better than I thought it would be. And dry is a relative term. I mentioned this too. Our current averages are based on 1991 to 2020. That was mostly a wet 30 years in the United States. So just because you're 2.5 inches below average, that's average if you took the long term, 50 or 100-year average. And so again, there's reasons to have some positivity for this upcoming growing season in North America. There's always exceptions. Again, I can't emphasize enough. My analog package probably has more areas below average rainfall than above. But again, we're starting good, and that below average, if it's only 1 to 3 inches, that's pretty close to the long-term average. So it looks pretty promising. Again, I wouldn't be surprised I'm saying the exact opposite of this in 2025. But 2024, again, there's reasons for optimism.
What are the implications on that for water levels in the Mississippi River? Because you're right, yields did okay this year because maybe there was more moisture in the soil than people predicted. But in some ways, the hard thing was getting things, if you were using the Mississippi River complex, was getting your product out because the river was so low. Is there any respite for the river itself, or do you think we're talking about another year of news stories about how low the Mississippi is going to be?
Here's the problem is, of course, winter precipitation is not when harvest season is, when the Mississippi River is the most useful for ag. And so, of course, in the spring, it's going to recover a little bit. If more areas are dry than wet, which I think is going to be the case next summer, guess what we'll be talking about next fall?
A dry Mississippi.
Yeah, the Mississippi not where we want it to be. And so I would lean towards that probably being a news story, but hopefully the dryness won't be quite as widespread as this year and add a little bit more moisture. So hopefully it won't be quite as bad. But I've mentioned this in other talks I've given. I think problems with the Mississippi might be a 2020s problem.
Yeah. I'm about to ask a question where everybody in Louisiana is going to, or in New Orleans at least, is going to collectively self-immolate right now because I'm not supposed to talk about this, but I'm going to ask. We didn't have a hurricane last season in New Orleans that hit New Orleans. I'm knocking on wood here if you can hear it on the podcast. Is there any reason for me to be as optimistic that we'll be spared for another year, or do you think this will be a more active hurricane season?
There are many reasons to believe that this hurricane season will be more active closer to the United States, including the Gulf of Mexico. El Nino is fading, and we're going to get a La Nina. And those transition years, if you look back through time, and the fact that the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation is still in its warm phase, so the Atlantic Ocean, generally speaking, is above average. To me, there, again, are reasons to believe that 2024 may be more notable for hurricanes in the United States than, say, every year something happens someplace, granted. But this year, I don't know what term they use. I wouldn't say, nervous or anything, but again, I would be surprised if it was a quiet year.
Are there more hurricanes or stronger hurricanes in a transition year like this, or if it's a straight La Nina, is that sort of worse for Atlantic hurricane season?
If you talk to most researchers, they'd probably tell you just straight out La Nina, like the last 3 years. But when I look back at it, a lot of times when I see the AMO positive and then this transition year is the year that surprises people sometimes. Again, I'm not a hurricane expert. I don't have a PhD, in that area. I just look at stats and look at the past and bring it to the current. And these are the years that kind of make me more nervous. And again, if you look back, there's reasons to believe. Plus, you alluded to this, I think, in our last podcast about, the Gulf of Mexico has been warmer than average, and so, and again, with this transition going away, La Nina, there's so many reasons to believe that we would see an uptick this year, especially in the Gulf. And as we all know, it only takes one storm.
Yeah. Before we get to other parts of the world, brief aside, you mentioned that we only have El Nino data going back to the 1950s, and I don't know. So did we know about El Nino?
Because most El Nino data starts from 1950 itself. Do we know that they existed before then and have some data? Absolutely. But it just wasn't measured very well. So really, if you want to do science, you just need good data. Do we know past years when there's La Ninas and El Ninos? Yes, of course. We've known about this, for centuries. Again, it was named El Nino, the Christ child, because they would peak around Christmas time like this one did. This year. And, from fisheries and stuff, we know that. But really, if you look back at NOAA data, and you almost always see it started in 1950 for data. And that's where I would trust it a little bit. And even that, I'm always the one. We were not measuring the oceans in the 1950s like we are now. There were no satellites. It was all boat reports. So when people say, well, look at this trend or look at that trend, I'd go, is there really a trend? Let's try to be scientists here. The data wasn't as good back then.
Well, that was my next question. What changed in 1950? So was it literally just they were sending people out in boats with big thermometers and sticking them in the ocean, or how did it work?
Well, more so because it's right after World War II, for instance. Bigger ships, bigger Navy, fighting the Korean War, fighting in Vietnam, just more trade. There's just more data became available. Why 1949 or 1950, 51? Why did they start in 1950? Honestly, I don't know. I should actually look that up. It'd be very interesting to know why that's the magical year. But all the data that I always present and show and I look at for history is that point. I will use analogs before 1950 in my data for other things. But if you're really looking at, ENSO again, that's official name, El Nino Southern Oscillation, really 1950 is the magical date.
There's a book idea here, Daryl, I'm telling you. So how do we measure that data now? So you reference satellites. So is it all satellites now that are taking temperatures, or how do we get that
We have
data?
a network of buoys that have, think of them as jellyfish. There's a buoy there, but then there's this long lead going down into the ocean quite a ways. So, sea surface temperatures we have known, for a fair amount of time because there's always the bucket, they're taking buckets out of out of the ships, when the water's going through, and they'd be measuring that temperature, for a long time, even in the 1800s. But that was always sea surface temperatures, and sea surface temperatures, that skin is not what's happening at 100 meters, 50 meters under the surface. Now that we have that buoy network, we can really see it. So you can watch now in 3 dimensions rather than 2 dimensions, what's happening, how deep that pool is. And it really gives us a strong indication of when, say, an El Nino or a La Nina is beginning, because you see this warm pool developing, and sometimes come up to the surface. So that buoy network, as well as still some ship readings, but really satellite and the buoys give us a vast majority of that data. And that buoy network is incredible. It's a good spent tax dollars on that.
Well, and so does the U.S. have buoys, and then Japan has buoys, and China has buoys, and everybody has their buoys next to each other, or does the U.S. give everybody access to the buoys? Like, how does the sharing of that info work?
I'll be honest, I'm just really familiar with the United States and NOAA and their buoy network, and that's, what I look at and see. I'm sure the other countries do. Again, you're asking me stuff I've always thought of researching more, so I have more details. I guarantee you they do, of course. You would almost have to. But I'm more familiar with NOAA. NOAA, all of the data from NOAA generally is freely available worldwide. And there's always, the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO. Even in the core of the Cold War, Russia needed our data and we needed Russians' data. Weather data has generally, for the most part, always been shared because it's useful for everybody to know. And that's the nice thing about the weather community.
Yeah, although I'm having this crazy conspiracy theory that one country could see a storm headed for another country. Can you cut off all of their weather monitoring equipment so they're not? I don't know. That's probably a crazy idea. Anyway, thanks for my random tangent aside. How's your 2024 forecast for South America looking?
2024, I mentioned the rest of really this growing season. Their soybean crop is down. Southern Brazil, that was really dry last year, which is a good chunk of their soybean crop. They've been quite wet, if anything, too wet, like Parna, that state. And so it kind of flip-flopped now. And Argentina, which had, really a 3-year drought, pretty devastating drought in some ways, they've gotten quite a bit of rain. And that's really the switch from La Nina to El Nino back and forth would be the biggest factor in that going forward. But I think with El Nino lasting, my analog package still keeps southern Brazil at or above average for moisture, but the areas north where that safrinha corn crop is growing also increases their moisture to at least average, maybe a smidge above. If that comes true, again, people send me stuff, people ask me questions. I've been in presentations where the person before me will say, the safrinha corn crop looks awful, it's too dry, it's going to be devastating. And I'm not an agronomist. I will tell people, as a meteorologist, it just does not look that dry to me, and I don't think the safrinha corn crop is going to be devastating. I mean, literally, one of my talks, someone said that before me, and I just go, again, I don't want to fight with anyone here. I would just have a different opinion, and it doesn't make me right, this person right, but I just think they're going to see an increase. So I think they will finish much better. The problem will be, of course, as they're planting next fall again, they should dry down. The rainy season should probably be delayed with a La Nina. And so we might go back to Argentina being dry, southern Brazil being dry, and then, Mato Grosso and some of those northern areas probably doing a little bit better next year because of that flip-flop. Because really, Argentina and Australia, the A countries, the correlation with just that ENSO is pretty high. Most areas you have to find other factors, but those two areas, it's pretty high. Brazil is a little bit different animal because they grow so much closer to the equator, and so it's more dependent on the rainy season, which is a little bit harder to go. But with the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which impacts South America too, and La Nina, I would think, this transition a little bit back to the reverse again, that 180-degree, you call it whiplash, a lot of people do, might actually occur in South America. So that's really what I think is going to be happening down there, that this year will get a little bit better. And I think the key there would be the safrinha corn crop, because some of the northern Brazil soybeans are just gone. I mean, it was so dry. They're not going to get much of a crop. But I think their second planting will do better. So that's what I would say for South America for this upcoming ending these growing seasons for them and then starting their planting season in the fall.
That's crazy because I feel like we just had the triple dip La Nina and terrible drought in Argentina and low water levels on the Paraná River and everything else. It seems crazy that we're already flipping back into that, but I guess time
it will very likely, though, Jacob, be a weak one. And if you look back at all these strong El Niños since the 1950s, every one of them had flipped the next year back to a La Nina. Some of them strong, some of them weak. This one will probably be on weak. But something we have not discussed yet is that this whole Pacific Decadel Oscillation, the PDO. And the PDO right now is negative. Huh? And if you understand this, you're going, how can the PDO be negative with a strong El Nino? Do you want to guess how many times we've had a strong El Nino with a negative, I should say, PDO?
I'll guess. I'm trying to judge based on your face what number I should divine. Let's say twice.
I really can only find one. And really that one is kind of lame. A lot of times you could use, no one else can see this but you, but this, the fix. It is, I should have mentioned it when you asked about strangeness. This is one of them, actually. And it's probably one of the reasons, again, why the typhoon season was down. And for a while, the PDO was pretty strong with a strong El Nino. And it's just like, that can't happen. But again, it did. And so, but because the PDO is negative, it's really, I think we'll transition this El Nino, this next La Nina, I should say, coming up. I think it's going to be weak just based on history, but it could possibly be moderate. And again, it's one of the reasons why I've always thought in North America, the 2020s were going to be drier overall, more years than not, because it deals with, the PDO in particular. And it's just in its negative phase. And boy, it did not. I thought for sure it would just switch neutral or briefly positive because of the El Nino and then flip back. It never did. It was just being really a tough guy up there, just going, I don't care there's an El Nino. I'm still going to be negative.
Well, and help me. So what does that mean that it's negative? Like, walk me through what the PDO is, because that's a new one for me.
Well, the PDO is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and it's a shift, and it's really based on North America. So when the water's off the west coast and are colder than average, it's considered the cold phase or negative phase. And then what happens is the northwestern Pacific, say northeast of Japan, then would be colder than average. When now the west coast being colder than average and negative, then the central Pacific, if you look at anomaly maps, it's kind of like this big blob northwest of Hawaii, northeast of Japan. And it's a decadal oscillation. It oscillates every 15 to 30 years. And truth be, this was somewhat discovered because of salmon fisheries. Because along the west coast, they're the cold water loving fish. If you're in Portland or Seattle, wow, 15, 20 years, great salmon, this is awesome. And then, it just kind of stinks for a while. Well, the water's warmed up, and so the salmon all went north. A little bit different animal. But this impacts North America in the sense is that, again, X doesn't equal Y. But in a general sense, the PDO is negative is known for North American dryness. Warmer is generally known as North America a little bit more wet. And you can understand if the waters are warmer off the west coast, you're going to gather a little bit more moisture, storms, it kind of a domino effect that it's a positive feedback in a way, and colder than average is a negative feedback. And so especially in ag circles, it's mentioned a lot. I mention it a lot because, again, granted, the PDO is more than northern Pacific Ocean, but I always remind people that the Pacific Ocean is 38% of the planet. Yeah. And I always joke, what happens in the Pacific Ocean does not stay in the Pacific Ocean, to steal a little thing from Las Vegas. But it's very, very true. So it does also, it's a big influence as well as ENSO is, again.
Random aside, I was in Minot last week and had a terrible time with flights, and it wasn't just me though. So I landed super, super late on Monday night, and there are apparently only 3 cities with direct flights to Minot. Do you know what they are? It's Denver, a United hub, Minneapolis, which is a Delta hub, and there was an Allegiant flight that was going to Las Vegas that was 4 hours delayed. I felt bad because there were young children running around. They were waiting for their 4 hour delayed flight. But I was surprised that there's enough interest in the Minot to Vegas direct flight circuit. But if you want to say
every
something
airport in North Dakota, I think Allegiant flies to Las Vegas from directly.
Why?
It's a long winter up here, Jacob. We have to go to Las Vegas and have some fun.
There are a lot better places to go than Las Vegas. Anyway, what you were talking about with North American dryness made me think of a conversation I had with Adam Rosenzweig. It's Goering and Rosenzweig, I think. I always joke that they're Guildenkrantz and Rosenstern, or I forget, the Hamlet characters. But I had to do an interview with him. And this guy focuses on natural gas and energy commodities and things like that. A lot of listeners probably know him, and he's very, very bullish on these commodities. And he said in the conversation with me that there were lots of signs that the United States was having similar weather patterns and things like that to the Dust Bowl era early in the 20th century. And I wasn't prepped enough and didn't know enough how to pick that apart. And I don't know what kind of data we have from that period too. If you had him in front of you, would you take exception with that? Would you say, there's some things that say that, but it's a reach, or is there actually something to it?
Oh, there's something to it. It might be a reach for that amount of dryness to occur. That was very extreme. And the other factor, when people bring up the 1930s, I look at more as patterns. So much of that heat was human-induced in the fact of soil erosion. And so we have all this soil sitting around, very powdery, that sits on the surface. So you can literally take a heat wave and make a 105 day, which happens, and turn it into a 116 degree day. And so we've taken that impact away. I don't know if we would ever see temperatures that warm again, because we've controlled that factor right there. But I think more so he was talking probably the pattern. And I really would not argue with him on, I think I know what he was talking about there, and it does make sense. I mean, here in North Dakota, this has been an exceptionally warm winter. Wow, thank you. My heating bill from Xcel Energy is much, much lower. I'm very thankful for that. But our trend for winters in North Dakota this century, because we're almost a quarter of the way through, has been a downward trend. Our winters are getting colder right now, not warmer. On the long-term trend, that harks back, to what he's talking about. There are long-term oscillations and pattern in the weather that we don't 100% understand, number one. And number two, people call them cycles. I don't like that term because that sounds like a clock. And so sometimes I'll hear, hey, Daryl, have you ever heard of the 178-year drought cycle? And I go, I've read about that. I think there's something to it, but I don't like it that you're calling it whatever it is, like 178 years, because it's probably like more of every 150 to 200 years, looking at proxy data, we've gone through these cycles, but it's not that perfect. I always like calling them phases. Like the 1990s, 2000s, much of the Midwest was wetter than average. It's the wetter phase within our climate. And you go back proxy data, this has happened dozens of times in the last 1,000 years. And so there's something to it, but don't think of it as, okay, it's going to last 15 years. And then people take it, too precise. But again, what he's talking about, these long-term, I think these cycles that do exist, I would call them their long-term phases. To me, that does exist. So I don't think he's crazy at all.
This is one of the reasons you and I like each other, because I have this experience with The Fourth Turning, Neil Howe's famous book, and even with my old boss, George Friedman, where they create these cycle arguments. And there are kernels of truth within them. Like, they map some things up really greatly. But then you get these legions of people who are like, the cycle ends here and begins here, and now we're at the beginning of it. It's like, it's a heuristic. It's not meant to be a literal thing. But heuristics don't make bestsellers, I guess.
And that's a good way of putting it. I'm glad you said that. I might actually use that.
Good. There you go. Tell the Nerd Night folks that I'm available. I'm going to ask you an impossible question right now, but it just occurred to me, and we'll see how you can dance around it. Let's say you're somebody who's trying to minimize climate risk, whether for where they're going to live or where they're going to put a factory or things like that, over a long period, over the next 20 to 30 years. From just strictly a weather perspective, where is the least risk? What part of the world is going to have the least risk from a weather perspective over the next 20, 30 years? And of course, all it takes is one storm. Just because it's the least risk doesn't mean that there's no risk, or that, a tornado might not plop down in a place that it's never been before. But what parts of the world do you think have the least risky weather going forward over the next couple of decades?
Oh, I would just look back at statistics and tell you where was the least risky spot in the next 100 years, last 100 years, because I don't think the next 30, 40 years are going to be any different. I don't think the risk in any one different spot is any different than the last 100 years.
And where is it? Did I stump you? It's okay if you want to go look at the data.
It's hard for me to relate. I would say, Europe has a pretty good climate overall. That's why the population there historically was just blew up at times. But, I'm thinking of it in the sense of, where I live, no earthquakes. The risk of tornadoes is pretty low. We get blizzards, but they don't damage anything. And we have energy to keep us nice and warm and toasty. Anywhere along the coastlines of the United States is risky from hurricanes. The West Coast, that's why there's 38 million people or whatever it is in California, because outside of earthquakes, their weather risk is really, really low, out there. And so people, so I would just use those standard areas because the risk is reasonably low, because no place is risk-free. The Midwest is very risk-free outside of tornadoes. The Southern Plains get a little bit more, but statistically, the odds of any given spot getting hit by a violent tornado is pretty low. But to me, I would emphasize, I really don't think the next 20 or 30 years the weather's going to be any different than the past 50 or 100 years. Mm-hmm. It's just the weather goes through different phases, and truth be told, again, violent tornado numbers in the United States is down. Hurricane numbers are steady to slowly decreasing on a worldwide scale. They have been up in the Atlantic Ocean, but that's gone through cycles when we go forward. The risk from weather disasters has dropped by 98% for any given human being in the last century because of the protections, the amount of energies we have, our building structures and stuff going forward. Nowhere near the deaths that we had 100 years ago happen with weather-related stuff. And so, sometimes people just need to be reminded of that. Yeah, bad things happen, but it really, we're much safer than we've ever been in the past, mainly because of our infrastructure, our dominant supply of energy that all of us have. I wouldn't even want to imagine living in a sod house in North Dakota again, but people did, and sadly people died because of it. So that's why I would answer it that way, Jacob. I would not pick New Orleans, by the way.
Oh, don't worry. I know that. I'll have to play the drinking game to give you some insights into my thinking on that. But I do not expect to be here for the long haul. Sorry, New Orleans residents, but neither should you. And you shouldn't either, because look at our property insurance and what's happening to property insurance in Louisiana, in the entire Gulf Coast region. I don't know how that's going to work, but that's an aside. Daryl, I have to ask you the question, and maybe you'll like this question. Maybe I'll tee you up correctly, and I'll get you out of here on this. I'm sure people will be listening, and what they'll want to know is, but global temperature is rising. Isn't global warming happening? Isn't that supposed to be making all of these things worse? Everything we hear is about how we're going to way surpass whatever it is, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century and things like that. So I have a feeling you're going to tell me, hey, these oscillations matter more than that trend. But tee it up. If somebody listens to that and says, come on, dude, tell me about how that intersects with warmer temperatures, how would you respond to that?
Well, humans aren't the only reason why temperatures are going up. And I know that's not a popular thing to say, but I would say that's a fact-based statement. We do have oscillation patterns in the oceans, for instance, that have increased that. Most of the warming on the planet have occurred near the poles, where really no one lives. Temperatures haven't risen much where most of human civilization is at. There's no doubt temperatures have risen a little bit, and there's no doubt humans have had some of that impact. But generally speaking, what has really changed in the last 30 years? And again, when I was a kid, I was told there's going to be an ice age by the year 2020, and that bad things were going to happen. And I'll be honest, when I was a kid, it scared me to death. Let's put soot all over the ice to melt the polar caps. I'm not saying scientists are worse now than they were better, but you have to remember, again, that sometimes people take small truths and blow it out of proportion as clickbait and getting stuff. And that sells newspapers, which is now ad revenue on websites. So again, please don't email me or tell me I'm a denier. I am no way, shape, in any form. I'm a realist. And the reality is most of these changes have been reasonably subtle, and therefore, these little minor changes through time. But again, most of the stuff that you've heard was going to happen hasn't happened. And actually the trend is opposite what most people think. Will that continue? Probably not. But again, phase changes on it. I just think humans are inventive enough that we can handle the subtle changes that are going to occur. And again, I know it's not a popular opinion. I don't get clickbait revenue for those statements. But again, not a denier. It's just sometimes these things are way overblown, what's going to happen. And have any of those way overblown things happened? All the Arctic ice is going to be gone by 2008, 2009. They always pass the buck down there. And then to me, that's not really science. And if you hear the people that are saying that the most, you'll notice they're not scientists.
And don't worry, Daryl, I think we self-select for people who are not looking for the clickbait. They're looking for the sort of deeper truths here. I will say, though, that if what Daryl just said makes you stiffen in violent disagreement, like me, you should probably go spend some time Googling things about the geopolitics of weather buoys and the Pacific Decadel Oscillation and all the other homework I've given to myself after our chat. I always walk away with things I need to learn about after we talk. Anything I didn't ask you that you want the listeners to know about, Daryl, or do you want to call it there?
I probably should call it there so I stay out of trouble.
Oh, we like trouble, but that's fine. We'll let you get out of here, and thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon, okay?
Oh, I am always, honestly, this is one of the highlights of my year every time I'm on this podcast, so always thank you for the invite.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.